Hi everyone. We are about to start our last session representing alternatives, and our first speaker is Nicolò Cesana-Arlotti from Baltimore University, Johns Hopkins University from Baltimore. Your word.
Thank you, Paula. Hello everybody. Today I will present a study that I started when I was during my first postdoc here at Central European University in collaboration with Aghi and Erno. And in this study, we try to provide evidence of the presence of logical representation and basic logical computation in infants. And also we started to try to characterize the role, the function that this kind of representation might play in the infant mind. Evidence coming from psycholinguistics, developmental psycholinguistics, suggests that the logical vocabulary emerged relatively late in a developmental perspective, in the sense that those lexical items that are used in natural language to express logical relation, like no, not, and or, are acquired, they are used by infants. We have evidence that infants start to use these lexica, these words, produce and understand with a logical meaning only toward the end of the second year of life. This lack of evidence of linguistic logical capacities or abilities in earlier in infancy open a very, what I think is a very exciting question for people that are interested in the foundation of human logical reasoning ability on one end and in infants' cognitive abilities. And there is the possibility that in the mind of an infant there might be something like a preverbal logical concept. Meaning by that a representation that predates the acquisition of the logical vocabulary, but capture at least some important aspect of the conceptual role of a logical concept, of a logical representation. In a study published in 2018, we provide some first evidence that infants as young as 12 months might be able to perform some basic logical computation, meaning that they we provide evidence that they might be able to infer the identity of an hidden object inside the cup, an ambiguous object, which identity was compatible with two alternatives, by using evidence that exclude one of these alternatives. And in this way form an expectation regarding what was the identity of this object inside the cup, and react with surprise to a subsequent event that violate this expectation, like to find that object outside the cup. This first evidence, from my point of view, open many very exciting questions. The first question is what might be the representation and the computation that supports this kind of abilities in preverbal infants, and relatedly to this question, what is the type of functions that these preverbal disjunctive inferences might play in the infant mind. And in particular, with Aghi and Erno, we focus on a particular function that logical representation might play in cognition, that is an epistemic function, in the sense that there is a sense in which logical representation might be used as a source of knowledge. This might seem very counterintuitive, but the idea to explain what I mean, I will use the example of Sherlock Holmes and his investigative method. When Sherlock Holmes had to solve a crime, he tried to determine the details of an event that happened far away in time. And his approach was starting by considering the hypotheses that were compatible with the available evidence. And after that, he tried to collect additional evidence or arguments to rule out this alternative one by one, till the moment in which only one alternative was left. And at that point, the remaining alternative was inferred with high certainty. And this process of elimination is very simple from the point of view of his logical structure, but is sufficient to show a very important feature of logical representation, from my point of view, that they allow the testing of an hypothesis, even in the absence of evidence that directly support, confirm or disconfirm that hypothesis, but based on the understanding of the logical representation among a space of hypotheses. But this is not the end of the investigative strategy of Sherlock Holmes, because what he usually did is that after drawing a conclusion, he usually used conclusion as evidence, as premises for additional inferences, like there might be also very different character, like inductive inference or abduction. And so in this sense, the conclusion of logical inferences, at least in adult condition, are inferentially productive. They may be the starting point for doing inference, therefore reasoning, therefore learning. Okay, and so basically we are interested, I think I can skip this slide, but so the critical question at this point is, for me at least, became very interesting, whether this kind of logical road to knowledge, to evidence acquisition is viable early in life, when learning is most needed. And so, in other words, what the study that I'm going to present today try to tackle the answer of whether these early disjunctive inferences that I showed you before can play in the infant's mind the role of a source of evidence, in the sense that their conclusion are inferentially productive, can be integrated in new computation, generating, and so they can, in principle, generate the acquisition of knowledge. In the first experiment of the study that I'm going to show you today, we focus on infants' ability of representing other people's action as goal-directed, and to use their information about other people's goal-directed action as a source of evidence for the attribution of motivational state, like preference, desire, or goal, in an accurate way. And in experiment 1, 14 months old were presented with a familiarization procedure in which, for 6 familiarization trials, they see an agent, an end, the one that you see in the picture, constantly choosing one of 2 objects, in this case, the car. We know from many experiments that even much younger infants presented with this kind of evidence attribute to the agent a positive disposition toward the goal object, and use this attribution to form expectation about what the agent will do in new situations. In our test movie that now I'm going to show you exactly what the infants saw, basically we use this attribution to test infants' reasoning ability.
Sia, Baba.
So it was made in Hungary. So infants were introduced with 2 objects with an identical upper part. And then they were displaced in this way. This kind of ambiguous displacement has the results to make the identities of these objects completely ambiguous. The spatiotemporal history of this object is sufficient to tell you exactly which object is on the right and which object is on the left. And the visual part of this object, while it's sufficient to signal the presence of the object, at the same time is compatible with both the object you have seen before. So it's impossible to say that, for example, where is the location of the car now, the goal object, the preferred object of the agent that I showed you before. However, as an adult, at least we can clearly anticipate what is the space of possibility here. So, for example, that for each one of these objects, this object has to be either the car or the ball that I showed you before. After that, in our movie, we reveal the position of the competitor object, the object that was the competitor during the familiarization. Then enter the scene and reach for one of the 2 objects. And our question was, although the favorite object of this agent, his goal, is not present, is not visible in this scene, cannot seen, and even this location cannot be remembered by using memory alone, our question is whether infants were able to infer the location of the car and use this information to evaluate the behavior of this agent. So this is the structure of our experiment, 6 familiarization trial, and then the test that I showed you. There were 2 possible actions in the test, a consistent choice in which the agent reached for the hidden car, and an inconsistent choice in which the hand reached for the car, for the ball that was just revealed. Of course, the role of the object was counterbalanced. And our question was whether, even in this condition, infants were able to evaluate whether these actions were consistent with the preference previously demonstrated by the agent. And what we found that this was the case. The 14-month-old looked longer at the inconsistent choice than the consistent one. However, this might be not enough to show that infants know where is the location of the car. There might be another way in which infants might have detected the inconsistency of the action of this agent. At least in principle, it's possible that when infants are presented with the classic evidence of a Woodward paradigm, they might not just encode a positive disposition of the agent toward the favorite object, but they might also encode a negative disposition toward the object that was systematically avoided during the 6th test trial. If this is the case, they might be able to detect the inconsistent choice even without ever knowing where the car was, but just because the location of the car, of the disliked object, was revealed, and of course there is an inconsistency between disliking a car and yet disliking a ball, and yet reaching for it. And so our question is, are infants able to detect the inconsistent choice also under this condition? Okay, so, sorry, I skipped one step more. So what I wanted to say is that our question was whether the strategy that the infants used to detect the inconsistent choice was based on the attribution of this negative attitude toward the competitor object. In order to test whether this was the case, we tried to leverage on one feature of the computation that lead to preference attribution in infancy, and in the fact that there is at least some evidence that infants can generalize preferences. In the sense, if they are familiarized with a preference of an object A, a car, over an object B, in this case, over an object B, then they will expect that the agent will choose the car again, even when it's contrasted with a new competitor, an object C. And so what we did was a very minimal manipulation. We just changed the competitor in our familiarization. So the familiarization competitor was the ball, while the the familiarization competitor was a telephone, and then in the test it was switched with the ball. But what is important about this manipulation, that since we switch the competitor between the test and the familiarization, even if infants attribute a negative disposition toward this object, they will not be, this information lead to no expectation during the test because there is no telephone in the test. And what we found is that infants, again, were surprised by this, by the inconsistent choice, detect the inconsistent choice, suggesting that they know where the car was and use this information to evaluate the consistency of the behavior of the agent. But at that point, we moved to the critical question that I mentioned before, and is whether these preverbal disjunctive inferences are inferentially productive. And the way we test these things was by asking whether infants can use the conclusion of preverbal disjunctive inference to generate a preference attribution, whether this conclusion could be integrated with a computational system that generates preferences attribution. And the way we addressed this question was by flipping the structure of our experiment. Now it was during the familiarization that the objects were occluded at the time of the reaching, and that the infants had to infer the location of the goal object, because the end was always reaching for, during the familiarization, for the object that was hidden, and that to be inferred by exclusion. And then during the test, we tested whether infants could perform this preference attribution based on inferential evidence by presenting the infants with two visible objects, as a choice between two visible objects, and we replaced the competitor to prevent the use between familiarization and test to prevent the use of the strategy that I mentioned before based on a negative attribution, the attribution of a negative disposition. And what we found is that even in this condition, the infants were capable to detect the inconsistent choice. So these results suggest that infants were able to integrate the conclusion of this preverbal disjunctive inference with the computation leading to the goal, the attribution of a preference, and therefore that the conclusion of this type of inference is inferentially productive. And actually it's quite a solid type of evidence, because the infants succeed in the attribution after the same amount of familiarization as when in the previous experiment the two objects were fully visible. And so, in principle, this first result suggests to the possibility that the logical road to knowledge acquisition I mentioned before might be actually viable for two infants. And one of the important ingredients of the story of how infants succeed in developing an adult-like mind might be their ability of generating evidence and learning by using their the capacity of understanding logical relation between hypotheses. So this is everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico.
I would like very quickly to thank Sagi and Erno for their support and their help with this work, and also all the staff of the Baby Lab here at Budapest, the research assistant, the lab manager that help us to collect the data and test the infants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nico. We have time for questions.
So I think this is a beautiful experiment showing that the child can integrate the output of an inference with to have the computational role of reasoning about goals, et cetera. The question is it a logical inference? So it might well be, right? I mean, it certainly could be, but it also is open to the deflationary one-to-one mapping alternative as well. So the point is, it's just as urgent to figure out ways of separating between these. The fact that you can use, I mean, there are many kinds of inferences that aren't logical inferences. So there's definitely an inference here. And the question is exactly what the structure of the inference is.
You're very clear, Susan. I think that part of the way to answer whether these inferences are logical, whatever does it mean to perform a logical inference at 12 months, is try to characterize what are the representation that support this kind of inference. And so I am absolutely on board with that. And I just would like to mention that when I think about what is a one-to-one mapping computation, I'm not sure that under any account, and particularly under the account that can explain this data, this is not a logical representation. In the sense that there is at least one sense in which one-to-one mapping is a relation between sets. And so the representation of second-order relation that will, for many reasons, I think will qualify as a logical representation. And then I finish that I want to mention is that what is critical is that at the time of the mapping, the identity of the object was hidden. So the only evidential basis to decide to map the car on the remaining object was the fact that at that point, the ball was excluded. So what I'm saying is that there might be one-to-one mapping that might be based on like a viable perceptual evidence, but this is not the case. It should be a different kind of inference. Thank you.
Any questions from the back?
So just a beautiful experiment as well. Quick question on experiment 3. There's a detail in the method that I wasn't sure about. Is the hand reaching before you reveal, before the inference can be made, or after? Because that could change the interpretation.
Yes. I was very fast, so sorry for that. So the familiarization movie of experiment 3 are exactly like the test movie that I showed you before. So the objects are ambiguously displaced. We reveal the location of the competitor objects, like for example, where is the ball, and then the hand reach for the other object. So. I would like to understand why do you think this might be interesting?
So if we have time, well, I think that's interesting because in that case, it means that at some point, inference will have to represent that the goal is ambiguous. And so that would be, if we consider those are about disjunction, then the disjunction would be potentially about a goal representation and not about an object representation.
So yeah, I think this is very interesting. I think the approach that you propose is interesting, but it might be problematic in the sense that we cannot exclude that infants do like some kind. We don't know. We cannot assume at what point exactly infants a priori. I mean, at what point exactly infants will do the integration of this information and what kind of representation, whether they will represent a goal or not. But I think that there might be other designs, other approach that might address exactly this question that I think is extremely interesting.
Any more questions? If not, then let's thank our speaker, Nico. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you need the controller?
Mariel K, yeah, exactly. Can you help me remember which one is which? So we need this thing. So we need the audio jack, right? The audio one and but then also the audio. Here we go. Great. Okay, and then this one.
So our next speaker is Mariel Goddu from University of California, Berkeley.
Great. All right, thanks very much. Good evening. My name is Mariel Goddu, and today I'm going to be presenting work with Nikki Sullivan and Karen Walker that demonstrates that 18 to 30-month-old toddlers are capable of holding multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously. So in the current experiments, we take a new causal reasoning approach to this problem and find that children can actually succeed much earlier in this causal context than other experiments have shown. So I'm going to tell you about some of the previous research and the differences with our causal paradigm. But before I get started, I want to just take a moment to kind of emphasize the importance of reasoning about possibilities and sort of why this is an interesting developmental problem. So what are possibilities? Possibilities, and here comes a definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Possibilities are facts about modality as opposed to facts about actuality. So they're facts about how things could, must, or could not have been. And the ability to reason about possibilities is really important because it provides the foundation for a lot of the kinds of skills that we think of as being sort of really mature, sophisticated, uniquely human cognitive abilities. And these include things like future hypothetical thinking. So for example, if you packed to come here, the kind of thinking that you engaged in, considering possibilities in the future when you did that. Counterfactual reasoning. This is a kind of reasoning that I've engaged in a lot at this conference. For example, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. Why didn't I come all of these other years, right? So considering possibilities in the past. And finally, just sort of everyday sorts of problem solving. Oh my gosh, I can't get into my Airbnb, right? Is it something, do I have the wrong key? Is it something about the knob, or is it the way that I'm sort of holding it, right? So this kind of problem solving sort of involves entertaining possible reasons or explanations in the service of discovering some solution or desired outcome. Okay, so all of these things require reasoning about multiple possibilities, but the puzzle is that a lot of previous research suggests that tracking multiple possibilities is in fact really difficult. It's a late developing skill. And so I'm going to give you a flavor of the kinds of tasks in which kids fail to consider multiple possibilities, and then I'm going to introduce our causal paradigm where kids were actually able to succeed. Okay, so here is a task where children fail to consider multiple possibilities. So this is a study with 5 and 6-year-olds. And in the study, kids are introduced to a house that has 3 doors. And they're also introduced to 3 different colors of blocks. And they learn some rules about these blocks in a training trial. So for example, kids learn that black blocks always come out of the first door. Yellow blocks always get pushed out of this second door, and green blocks always get pushed out of this third door. And the children also learned to use some trays to catch the blocks as they emerge from these different doors, including some trials where they actually have to put out 2 trays to catch multiple blocks as they emerge. So they receive experience using 2 trays. The critical part of the task comes when children are shown 2 buckets, one that contains all black blocks and the other that contains an equal parts mixture of yellow and green blocks. And in the test trials, children watch an experimenter reach into one of the buckets, pull out a block, but they can't see what color it is, and then they have to repair to catch it as it comes out of the house. So here's what happens. If the children know that the experimenter is pulling from the black block bucket, then they're great at putting the tray right where it belongs and catching the block as it comes out. However, if children see that the experimenter is pulling from the green and yellow mixture bucket, they actually fail to put out 2 trays to kind of cover their bases, right, to account for both of these possible outcomes. They only put out one or the other, and this is a phenomenon known as premature closure. They only prepare for this one possibility. In another slightly simpler task, 3 and 4-year-olds are introduced to a forked tube, which looks like this, and they're shown that a toy mouse can be put in the top, who's going to fall down the tube and come out of one of these 2 openings at the bottom. And the question is, when given the opportunity to put out some cotton to sort of soften the mouse's landing when he comes down, will children opt to put cotton under both of the openings or just under one? And it turns out that here, kids again make the same mistake. They only put out 1 cotton ball. And finally, in a recent nonverbal version of this task with 2, 3, 4-year-olds and apes, 2-year-olds' performance was very similar to the apes in that they only put out 1 hand on the majority of the trials, and only 50% of 3-year-olds and 3.5-year-olds put out both hands on the first trial. So it seems like reasoning about multiple possibilities is really, really difficult for kids. And this is seemingly corroborated by the fact that they're also really bad at many forms of future hypothetical thinking and counterfactual reasoning, by some accounts until they're about 9 or 10 years old. However, and here is where we start in with our approach. However, children are really good at tracking the kind of multiple possibilities that you need to do in order to do causal reasoning, which is to say the kind of reasoning that involves sort of considering multiple possible reasons or explanations for some observations or generating and tracking hypotheses. So for example, we know that 19 to 24-month-olds can learn from evidence to infer which blocks cause a machine to play music. So for example, given a sequence of evidence like this, these make it play, these make it play, this does not make it play, what should we put on the machine to make it play music? Children can easily infer that the purple block is the one that makes it go. And in addition, we know that 16 to 24-month-olds, so really, really little kids, can learn from evidence to make causal attributions. So for example, they can infer whether a toy is not working because it's broken or because of their own incompetence based on the evidence that they receive. And these are just two examples from a really extensive causal reasoning literature that really takes as its premise, right, this idea that kids can and do track distinct possibilities and their relative likelihoods. And so here's what we wanted to do in this study. We wanted to make a causal reasoning task that aligned closely with the kinds of tasks where children fail to consider multiple possibilities to see if they could succeed in this causal context given their general competence, early competence with causal reasoning. So our strategy was to show children evidence, a sequence of causal evidence that accords equally well with two distinct hypotheses. And in order to have two distinct hypotheses, we capitalize on the fact that toddlers can actually learn hypotheses at different levels of abstraction. So what do I mean by that? So in addition to learning rules about individual causation, so for example, purple makes it go, we also know that toddlers can learn relational causal rules. So for example, given this sequence of evidence, toddlers will generalize the rule that two not same blocks make it go and choose the novel pair on the right to put on the machine in order to make it play music, even though they've never seen it before. So bearing that in mind, I'm going to show you now the sequence of evidence that we used in each of the 4 experiments of this study, so pay attention because this is the critical thing. So what you're going to see is 4 pairs of blocks that get put on this machine, 2 of which make it play music and 2 that don't. So here we go. These blocks make the machine play music. These blocks do not. These blocks make the machine play music, and these blocks do not. So you'll notice that there's both a relational causation hypothesis here, right? So 2 non-identical blocks might be the thing that causes the machine to play music, but there's also an individual causation hypothesis. So you'll notice that this black block is repeated in each of the 2 causally active pairs. So there's actually 2 causal hypotheses that accord equally well with the evidence that you see. So in this project, we used this ambiguous causal evidence to investigate participants' ability to track multiple possibilities, multiple hypotheses at the same time in this causal learning task. And in a very first experiment with adults on MTurk, we established first that adults have no preference for either the individual or the relational form of causation. And here's how we did that. We presented the adults with this ambiguous causal sequence, and then we gave them a choice between 2 pairs of blocks. We asked them, which block should we put on the machine to make it play music? So the pair on the left accords with the individual hypothesis, right? And the pair on the right accords with the relational causation hypothesis. And you'll notice also that all of these blocks are associated with the effect. And what we found is that neither of these hypotheses is preferred. And so there's no baseline preference in the population for relational versus individual causation. But this could be because they're tracking just one of the 2 possible hypotheses, or it could be that they're tracking both and they weren't able to express that to us because we gave them a forced choice. And so in experiments 2 and 3, experiment 2 is with adults and experiment 3 is the same thing with toddlers, we begin to disambiguate these possibilities. So in experiment 2, we asked whether, in a between subjects design, whether adults might track both hypotheses. So what we did is we had half of the participants in a relational causation condition and the other half in an individual causation condition, and here's what that looked like. So all participants across both conditions always see the same sequence of ambiguous evidence, but those participants who were in the relational causation condition had to choose between two novel relational pairs, so they only got a choice between this novel not same and novel same pair. And in the individual causation condition, participants had to choose between the likely individual causal candidate, and one of the two other blocks that was associated with success as a kind of decoy, and we counterbalance this across participants. And what we found, and so if it's the case, right, if it's the case that adults are really just picking one hypothesis, either this individual causation or the relational causation hypothesis, and kind of sticking with it, then we might see results very similar to experiment 1, right? But if they don't, if they're well above chance in both of these conditions, well, then that begins to suggest that maybe participants are actually tracking both hypotheses. And that's in fact what we found. In both conditions, adults were well above chance in selecting the appropriate choice. Experiment 3 was exactly the same methods, more or less, with toddlers, except for this time we tested, so we had 30 toddlers, and we tested them in person instead of via YouTube videos on MTurk. And toddlers, as well, were able, in each of the conditions, above chance to choose the appropriate choice based on the ones that they received. So now the critical experiment, though, because so far we only have the suggestion, right, that participants are tracking both possibilities. But the critical experiment is experiment 4, which is an experiment within subjects with toddlers. So in this experiment, we asked whether toddlers actually track both hypotheses. And our goals here were to first replicate the results of experiment 3 with a larger sample of kids. And then we actually added a second test question and had participants provide an answer to the additional question. So they saw, all the subjects saw the sequence of causal evidence. They got either the relational causation question or the individual causation question first. And then they made their choice. The experimenter took the blocks away. They didn't get any feedback, and they had to subsequently make a choice about the other one. So here is what that looked like.
All right, so this is my toy. And sometimes when I put things on top of my toy, it plays music. And sometimes when I put things on top of my toy, it doesn't play music. Let's see how it works. Let's try. Music! Let's try again. Music! So these ones made my toy play music. Let's try. No music. Let's try again. No music. These ones did not make my toy play music. All right, let's try. Music. Let's try again. Music. So these ones made my toy play music. Okay, let's try. No music.
No music.
Let's try again. No music. So these ones do not make my toy play music. Okay, so now that you know how my toy works, I need your help finding the thing that'll make my toy play music, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I have two choices for you. I have this one, and I have this one. And only one of these trays has the thing that'll make my toy play music. Can you point to the one that'll make my toy play music? Which one?
That one.
That one? All right, I have one more question for you. And then
So
I'll
no
give you a
feedback.
tray. So, I also have these, and I have these. And only one of these trays has the things that'll make my toy play music. Can you point to the tray that has the things that'll make my toy play music? Which one will make my toy play music?
That one.
That one? Do you want to try playing?
All right. So what we found in experiment 4 in this within subjects design is first that we replicated the results of experiment 3. So the majority of the toddlers chose appropriately on the first trial, regardless of whether they had the relational or the individual causation question. And of the 32 children who answered appropriately on the first question, 30 were able to also provide an answer to the second question. And of those 30 children, 73% chose correctly on a second trial. So overall, 50% of all of the toddlers tracked both hypotheses compared to 25% chance. So can young children reason about multiple distinct possibilities? Yes, they can, in a causal reasoning task. So here we see that 18 to 30-month-olds learn multiple equally likely causal rules at different levels of abstraction, and they flexibly apply them depending on the context. I have like a minute and a half left, I promise. So this raises the question, what's going on? Why can kids do this in a causal context but not in these other paradigms? And very, very quickly, I'm going to run through a quick list of some of the differences between these tasks, because obviously they are quite different. And some of them I think I want to characterize as task demands, and others are sort of more, I think, sort of deeper theoretical or conceptually interesting differences that I hope we get a chance to discuss. So first, prior tasks require mental simulation of physical events, whereas our task does not. And I think it's easy to imagine why removing this requirement might improve children's performance. Secondly, previous tasks require behavioral preparation, whereas this task merely requires sort of prediction about causal interventions. Conceptually, previous tasks require reasoning about mutually exclusive possibilities, which may sort of introduce a sort of above and beyond cognitive requirement or something extra to reason about, whereas here, the possibilities are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And finally, what I think of as the most potentially interesting difference, although all of these may be interesting, and I'm interested to hear what people think, one of the most interesting differences between these tasks is that prior tasks operationalize multiple possibilities as multiple possible outcomes, whereas in this task, we operationalize multiple possibilities as multiple possible explanations or hypotheses. And I think that this difference might highlight something that's sort of interesting for the whole investigation, the whole project of trying to figure out whether and how children track multiple possibilities. So I think there's multiple meanings for the meaning of possibilities depending on the context. And so far, research designs have really focused on the kind of possibilities that are grounded in sort of observable physical structures and the outcomes that might arise given those structures. I also gave an example of a normative structure, right, where you have this rule-governed structure that affords certain kinds of possibilities. And in contrast, the causal possibilities are really, really different, right? So here, possibilities are hypotheses about possible structures that explain the outcomes or constrain the outcomes. And I think that maybe the significance of these findings, one of the significant things about these findings is that it highlights the fact that maybe these kinds of causal possibilities, these structure positing possibilities may be more primary or prior to these other ones. And so I think it's an open question whether and how these different kinds of possibilities might be related to each other. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mariel. We have 2 minutes for questions.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I wonder how you're thinking about specifically tracking multiple possibilities. I wonder when kids are looking at the options presented to them, they could also retrospectively match it to the prior evidence that they have without necessarily keeping both of the hypotheses active at the same time, which is compatible with reasoning about multiple possibilities, but less of active tracking of multiple possibilities.
Sure. Thanks for this comment. I've realized I forgot to mention as I'm flying through this that we were quite surprised that kids were able to do. We did the between subjects design first because we thought that there was like no chance that kids were actually going to be able to, just given constraints on working memory and executive function. Like we read all this literature, it was like this isn't going to happen. So we think it's unlikely, I guess, like given what we know about sort of the limitations that people this age have in terms of the kind of cognitive capacities that would allow them to sort of replay or retrofit what they're seeing to the data that they observed. So I think we feel like it's unlikely that they're doing it backwards. But we don't know genuinely, I think. But thanks for raising the possibility.
Hi, I think it's a similar question. I guess I'm still wondering whether is this really multiple possibilities. So maybe another version of Nadia's question can be, maybe they were just thinking about the relational possibility, and then the individual ones, these blocks are what they observed before. So this just comes from prior associations with the effect. So I'm only thinking about the relational possibility, and then once this trial is done, I wasn't thinking about anything else, but then you give me one or the other, and I just use prior associations.
Well, I think, I mean, the argument there is that both of the blocks are associated with the effect. You're right in that the repeated block is associated more frequently with the effect, I guess. I mean, yeah, again, I think that's maybe it comes down to maybe unanswerable questions within this paradigm about like what it is exactly that the children are able to in fact sort of hold in mind at the same time. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if given these data I can actually speak to that, but thank you for raising that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, our speaker. So our next speaker is Mariel Leahy from Harvard University.
I'm interested in, can you hear me? Is this right? Good. I'm interested in possibilities for two reasons. The first is that they're super fun to talk about. And the second is, I think, less spectacular but more important, which is that possibilities are a case study in logically structured representation. So if someone can think a thought with a content possibly P, then their thoughts have the kind of structure that can underwrite deductively valid inference. And in this talk, I'm going to argue that children younger than 4 can't have thoughts with the content possibly P. Let's start with some data. In experiment 1, Susan and I have been using this paradigm developed by John Redshaw, where I drop a marble into this tube shaped like an upside-down Y, and it's the participant's job to catch it. I'll represent it schematically like this. I put a marble into this hole, and there's two things that might happen. It could come out the left, and it might come out the right. So if you recognize both those possibilities, you should cover both of the openings. Let's see what this 4-year-old has to say about it. Okay. Now he's 4, and he seems to understand what the possibilities are here. He uses these little verbs, can and could. And he gets his point across, even though he like totally misdescribes the problem. 2-year-olds rarely use 2 hands on this task. They look like they think they know where the marble's going to come out. 36-month-olds use 2 hands more often than not, though it typically takes them a couple trials to figure out how to use 2 hands, and they often regress to using 1 hand afterwards. 48-month-olds typically solve the problem spontaneously, and they rarely regress. So this gives us 2 key age groups. We want to look at 36-month-olds, who are the youngest age group, who use 2 hands more often than not, and we want to look at 48-month-olds, who spontaneously solve the problem and rarely regress. Now, does this task show us that 36-month-olds and most 48-month-olds are capable of representing multiple possibilities? No. It's a great start, but there's lots of simple strategies you could use to pass this task without thinking about possibilities at all. For example, there's 2 places, you have 2 hands, and you might just pair them up. More generally, this task does not require kids to show that they can tell the difference between what's possible and what isn't. That's why we introduced this tube. It has 3 places now, so it's no longer sufficient to pair hands with places. But there's also a unique best response, because marbles go in over on this side, and then there's 2 places that it might come out, and 1 place that it definitely won't. So you need to get your 2 hands under the 2 possible outcomes and avoid the impossible outcome. So adding a 3rd outcome makes pairing hands with places insufficient, but if you can recognize that there's 2 conflicting possibilities and tell how they're different from an impossible outcome, then you should be able to succeed. So we've got these two conditions, this Y-shaped tube that you can pass by pairing hands with places, and this three-arm tube where you have to compare alternative possibilities, conflicting possibilities, and contrast them with an impossible outcome. So our local questions are, is this tube harder than this one? And is there a difference by age group in how difficult it is? And we found a significant interaction between condition and age group. And for 48-month-olds, we did not find a significant difference between these two tasks, suggesting that, which is at least consistent with the hypothesis that 48-month-olds are comparing inconsistent possibilities and contrasting them with an impossible outcome. But for 36-month-olds, this three-arm tube was really difficult. For 36-month-olds, the apparent successes on the Y-shaped tube might come from pairing hands with places. It seems that 36-month-olds they're not identifying multiple incompatible possibilities and contrasting them with an they're not identifying multiple incompatible possibilities and contrasting them with an impossible option. Now, let me show you what goes into succeeding on this task. So this participant has just finished this three-arm tube, which she figured out. And now she's about to get her first trial on a condition that I'm not going to talk about today. And she makes her first decision kind of on autopilot because these two tubes look the same in the bottom half. And so watch what happens. What's interesting is what happens after she makes that autopilot decision. So check this out. She fixes her hair and looks down to the left and down to the right and makes this autopilot decision. But it doesn't work now because the marble goes in on the other side. So she simulates and simulates again and simulates the other side. Toss that one. Doesn't work. Follows the good one around. Simulates again. Thinks about it and makes her decision. Okay, now, the importance of this kid's behavior is that she runs multiple simulations. And to be fair, on this task, she doesn't actually need to compare incompatible possibilities, because she might just be like ruling out the impossible options and zeroing in on the one that works. But on the other hand, she did pass this task, so it seems like this kid in particular is capable of comparing alternative possibilities. So it looks like the original Y-shaped tube might overestimate both 36 and 48-month-olds' ability to represent conflicting possibilities. But what's going on here? What's the representational difference that accounts for the behavioral difference? Kids who really represent possibilities use what Susan and I have been calling modal representations of possibility. The point of thinking maybe P is to mark possibilities as worth considering, but not yet accepted. And there's lots of ways you might do this. I'm going to illustrate this with iconic models, just as an example. So in my mind, I have a model of the world. And that model might generate a question, for example, like, where will the marble come out? And I can simulate to generate possible answers. So for example, I can simulate it coming out the left, and I can simulate a marble coming out the right. And I can store these results in models of how the world might soon turn out to be. Models that I can't yet choose between. Models that I keep on the horizon as nearby candidates for my actual model. Now, these gray models store the results of incompatible simulations so that I can compare them. And they limit the range of possible answers to the question that I have in the actual world. And note also that I can't put the results of both of these simulations into this model on pain of inconsistency. And if I can't keep models on the horizon like this, I need to muddle through as best I can with just a single model. And if your model of the actual world doesn't nail down some relevant state, you need to look for more information. And if you can't look for more information, you might just simulate once and take the results of that simulation to be the facts of the actual world. This is something like what Ed Vol calls one-and-done sampling, and he's shown us how powerful a tool that is. But it does have some limitations. For example, in a situation like this, you might expect kids to just use one hand. We're calling this kind of situation where you run a simulation and assume that that the result is the actual facts, a minimal representation of possibility. The representation is generated by simulation and is merely possible, but it's not being treated as merely possible. There's no modal concept here that distinguishes this representation from a fully accepted fact. And note, you might be able to switch back and forth between alternative simulations, but at any given moment, you're wedded to one of these. You can't take both possibilities into account at the same time. So these children's conceptual apparatus runs together what will happen with what might happen, with what they can simulate. There's no logical structure here. But I hope it's clear that why in these modal representations of possibility, there is a logical structure. The gray coloring in these alternative models is a symbolic tool for marking representations as merely possible. And moreover, they have the kind of structure that you'd expect from possible world semantics. So it's true in this black model, the model of the actual world, that the marble might come out the left because there is an accessible world where it does come out the left. With this structure, you can distinguish what might happen from what will happen. Now, I'm sure lots of people are not convinced by my argument yet. There's lots of objections you might raise, like what if kids are just making weird assumptions about the physics of the tube? Or what if they have weird views about, like, or what if they see that third arm and think, oh, there's got to be some purpose to that thing. The guy obviously built it, so maybe that's a reason why they cover that one instead of the two possible options. And you might have some further questions like, can kids learn to do better? If 36-month-olds don't have modal concepts at all, they shouldn't be able to improve with just a small amount of training. And finally, is there a relationship between the ability to talk about possibilities and performance on this behavioral task? So that's why in experiment 2, developed with Susan and Esra Nur-Kuchuk, we gave kids 16 trials with this 3-arm tube. And 48-month-olds improved steadily across trials, but 36-month-olds improved much less, suggesting that they're not as capable of learning across trials. And in the middle of this experiment, we staged an intervention that had 3 phases. In the first phase, we asked kids 3 modal questions. We asked them, if I put a marble in here, can it come out here? If I put it in here, can it come out here? And if I put it in here, can it come out here? And then we talked to them about the physics of the tube. We just asked them questions about how the physics works, when nobody had any problems with any of those questions. And then in stage 3, we just repeated the modal questions. If I put it in here, can it come out here, etc. So repeating the modal questions lets us check whether talking about the physics improves performance on the linguistic task. And then we give them 8 more trials of this critical tube, checking whether the whole intervention improves performance on the behavioral task. So now I want to show you the kids who figured it out, the kids who started performing correctly and never went back to an incorrect performance. We're going to want to know how many kids figured it out from the first trial, from the second trial, from the 9th trial, and so on. Amongst 48-month-olds, 18 of 31 figured it out at some point, and the largest preponderance figured it out immediately after the intervention, and in fact, this is significantly more than you'd expect by chance. But amongst the 36-month-olds, only 5 of 25 ever figured it out. And as you can see, there's no systematicity at all to when they figured it out. There's really a qualitative difference here between the 36-month-olds and the 48-month-olds. On the first round of modal questions, we asked them, if I put the marble in here, can it come out here? If I put it in here, can it come out here? And if I put it in here, can it come out here? And if you really want to show that you understand these questions, you really got to get all 3 of them right. On the first round, only 16% of the 36-month-olds got all 3 questions right, compared to 50% of the 48-month-olds. And then we talked to them about the physics of the tube and repeated the questions. And at that point, 40% of the 36-month-olds got all 3 right, which is much more than you'd expect by chance. 16%, by the way, is not different from what you'd expect by chance, but 40% is. And this is, as far as I know, is this is the youngest demonstration that there is of children this age understanding these modal verbs. But at the same time, we don't know how they understand those concepts, so that's something we're going to come back to soon. 48-month-olds, the second time we asked the questions, more than 2/3 of them got all 3 right. So our intervention had an impact on how kids answered, the questions. But there was no relationship between answering the modal questions correctly and performance on the behavioral task. There's my mouse. Okay, so how can it be? How can it be that there's no relationship between performance on the behavioral task and performance on the linguistic task? How can kids answer questions correctly while failing on the behavioral task? Well, kids using minimal representations of possibility can constrain their simulations, so they won't simulate that it'll go out that way. And they can switch back and forth between simulations. They just can't consider two at the same time. And the modal questions are asked in sequence. So if I ask you, if I put it in here, will it come out here? I'm basically asking you, can you run this simulation? And kids, since they can, say yes. And then when I sequentially next time ask, can you do this simulation? They check whether they can and say yes. They don't need to represent multiple competing possibilities at the same time. They don't need a concept possible. They can get by with a concept that confuses what will happen with what might happen. But they might recognize that there's something wrong with that. And maybe recognizing that prompts them to construct separate meanings for will and might. Maybe this is what prompts a conceptual change. Now, I don't have a detailed proposal for how that would happen, but I do have one more video. So watch this participant's body language. So she seems uncomfortable saying that both possible outcomes are possible. And this is what we might expect from someone who's ready to construct modal meanings for might and will. So it seems that kids understand the physics of the tube. It seems unlikely that pragmatic struggles are going to account for all of the difficulties that 36-month-olds are having. It seems that 48-month-olds can learn to do a lot better, but it's not so clear amongst the 36-month-olds. And modal language seems to proceed, but does not predict behavior on the performance on the behavioral task. So what conclusions do we want to draw from this? Well, it seems that 36-month-olds might be using minimal representations of possibility, that they have concepts that confuse might and will. Some 48-month-olds might have distinct concepts of might and will, and learning to talk about possibilities might be a step towards developing modal concepts. Thank you, guys.
So we have some time for questions.
Thank you. I was wondering about a very basic looking phenomenon of asking a children whether they would want broccoli or chocolate. It feels to me that I'm not understanding something fundamental about possibilities, because on the face of it, that looks like a case to me where I have to consider the possibility of getting broccoli and the possibility of getting a chocolate, and moreover, I have to compare those possibilities and choose.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm wondering what distinguishes that kind of modality from this.
That's great. I mean, to solve this problem, I only need to look at the world in front of me as it is and understand that the question is asking me to choose one of these things, right? I don't need anything. I don't need to think any thought that has the content possibly P. I don't need to project myself into the future as at the same time eating exactly one of these, right? I only need to be able to look at the two options and choose one of them. I don't see why I need to have a representation that has the content possibly this and another one has content possibly that. I could, in sequence, simulate myself eating broccoli and then afterwards simulate myself doing something else, but that doesn't seem to require having the kind of structure that I'm trying to argue is what you need to have a logically structured representation of possibly P.
There was a question there in the back.
Hello? Oh, yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. Great talk. So I was thinking something, I think my question is sort of related to Gabor's, because, so you're talking about possibility assigned to simulations. And simulations are certainly just one kind of representation that we can entertain. And I was wondering whether you think that the possibility operator that you're talking about is a general kind of operator that applies to all kinds of representations, or whether it's specific to the kind of simulation that you talk about.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Johannes. So simulation is one way that we could arrive at modal representations. So like, if I simulate the marble coming out the left and simulate it coming out the center, and I'm capable of bearing those both in mind as inconsistent versions of a single event, then I'm going to have representations of possibility, modal representations. But there might be other ways that I arrive at that too without simulating at all. I have no need to commit to that. Nothing occurs to me at the moment, but absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
There's another question there.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was thinking about this talk with respect to the talk that came before it by Mariel, and I was thinking about Mariel's point about the possibility that the mutual exclusivity of the possibilities might be a particular issue.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there would be any problem with running your task and dropping two balls in there simultaneously. So now the two options are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Right. Yeah, so Jonathan Phillips and I have been discussing whether this merits running at quite some length. I think that's a good reason to think it doesn't, right? At the same, yeah, because it's no longer, because a key feature of this argument that I think distinguishes my approach from Mariel's is that what's interesting to me about possibilities is the representing two versions, at the same time, two versions of a single event, right? That's something that you can't do in a single consistent model of the actual world. And that's what we're interested in for having a logical structure. Like that's what gives us, when you can see that someone is taking that into account, then you see better evidence that their representations have a logical structure. But if you're using two marbles at the same time, then you might just be representing two distinct events, both of which are compatible, and therefore you might just be using a single model of the actual world. So I don't think it would show us what we're looking for. But I think it's a great idea, though. I've been having fun talking about it.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
And our last speaker of this session and for the conference as well is Sophie Bridgers from Stanford University.
So, hi everyone. As the last speaker of the conference, I just want to make sure to extend a really huge thank you to the organizers and the university for hosting such a wonderful conference. And I'm really excited to present some new work that I've been doing with Teresa Garcia and my PhD advisor, Hyo-an Guan. And this conference has been particularly exciting for us because a lot of the talks have actually helped us think about this study in new ways, or this set of studies in new ways. So I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts if you have some. So when we are physically interacting with another person in our environment, a major goal of our social reasoning is to coordinate our actions with this other person. We want to recognize when another person needs help and when we're able to step in and actually help them. We want to efficiently and effectively divide labor. We want to figure out what I want to figure out what I'm better suited to do, what you're better suited to do to accomplish a joint goal. And we also want to recognize what actions we can take in our environment to outsmart or outcompete others. And in order to succeed in all of these situations, we not only need to reason about what other people know or what other people want, but also what other people are physically capable of doing, so what they can and cannot do, and how their physical abilities compare to our own, so that we can coordinate our physical abilities with others to accomplish the desired goal. And we know from prior work that even preverbal infants are sensitive to their own physical abilities. Of course, we know this isn't always the case, but with proper motor experience, infants can become incredibly well attuned to their own motor abilities. So for example, they can become attuned to the widths of gaps that they're able to reach across, or whether or not an object is within their reach or outside of their reach, as well as the steepness of inclines that they're able to descend. And we also know that preverbal infants are really sensitive to other people's physical abilities and constraints. So if I'm an infant and I'm watching this scene, I can recognize that this big yellow agent is too big to fit through the opening in the black wall. And so for it to get to its goal, the little red agent, it actually needs to circumvent the wall rather than go straight through it. Infants also recognize that barriers can obstruct the paths of reaches. And as toddlers, toddlers recognize that physical constraints are important for figuring out what actions they should imitate or what actions they should perform. So if I'm wrapped in a blanket, a study I'm sure many of you are familiar with, if not all of you, wrapped in a blanket and I use my head to turn on a light, if the toddler is then given an opportunity to also turn on the light, they'll use their hands because their hands are free. But can young children combine and use these sensitivities in tandem to coordinate their actions with others? So there's lots of hints in the literature that this should be the case. So we know that toddlers are sensitive to when physical obstacles are preventing somebody from completing a goal, and they'll actually step in and remove that physical obstacle. 5-year-olds in a collaborative task can effectively divide physical resources. So in this task, if a 5-year-old has 2 tools available to them, both of which are needed to complete a goal, and their peer only has 1 tool available, the 5-year-old who has both tools available will select the tool that their partner doesn't have access to, allowing the 2 of them to complete the goal successfully, though 3-year-olds struggle in this same situation. And more recently, Rachel Magid and colleagues have shown that 4- and 5-year-olds can use age as a proxy for relative ability. So if a 4- or 5-year-old is shown a picture of a younger child and told that they're going to play a game with this child and that they're going to play a cooperative game with this younger child, the 4- and 5-year-old will assign the easier task to the younger child and the harder task to themselves. But if instead they're told that they would need to compete with this younger child, then they'll unabashedly assign the harder task to the younger child, making it easier for them to succeed. So all of these studies, including work looking at early sensitivities to infants' own physical abilities and others' physical abilities, points to the idea that children even younger than 4 and 5 might be able to coordinate their actions with another person based on what this other person can and cannot do. So across 2 experiments, we first asked, can 3-year-olds consider others' physical constraints to infer their action and then plan their own response? And whether or not they can flexibly respond to different physical constraints to infer the needed action or figure out how to help. So here we're presenting 3-year-olds with situations where they aren't actually faced with somebody who's struggling to achieve a goal, but rather they have to use physical constraint information to think about what this person likely struggled with and then plan their response. And so to do this, we created a scenario where 3-year-olds' smaller bodies actually made them more capable than a larger adult. So 3-year-olds were shown 2 boxes that looked like this. One box had a big hole on the front, and the other box had a small hole on the front, and 3-year-olds could easily reach inside both of these boxes. They learned that the experimenter could also easily reach inside the box with the big hole, but that unfortunately her hand was just too big to reach inside the box with the smaller hole. The experimenter then asked the child to place 2 identical birds, 1 into each box, and then she told them that they were going to take turns retrieving these birds from the boxes. So the experimenter went first. She brought up an occluder first, so children couldn't see which box she went to, and after a few minutes, she popped out with a toy. She said, "Look, I got a birdie. Can you help me get the other one?" So here again, 3-year-olds can't see where the experimenter went, but if they can keep in mind and use the physical constraint information that they just learned about, then they should be able to infer that there's probably still a bird in the box with the small hole because the experimenter couldn't reach inside that box. So they should then go and search for the other birdie in that small hole box. But it's also possible here that children might use a simpler heuristic. So the sizes of the holes also match the physical differences between the experimenter and the child. So maybe the child just thinks, the bigger experimenter goes with the box that has a big hole, and myself, the smaller child, I go with the box that has a smaller hole on the front. So we compared this condition to children's searches in the unconstrained condition. So here children were also presented with 2 boxes with different openings on the front, one large, one small. But now the experimenter can easily reach inside both of these boxes. She again asked the child to help her place toys into each of these boxes, but here the toys are actually different in identity. And she always takes out from behind the clutter the toy that was in the small hole box. So here, the pig. So if children can understand the structure of this task and don't have an overriding bias to search in the box with a small hole, then they should recognize that where they need to go is to this big hole box. So this experiment was with, the conditions were run within subject. So the participants participated in both in a counterbalanced order about a week apart. So what did we find? Along the y-axis, you'll see the proportion of children who are searching in the small hole box. In the constrained condition, we see that children do show a preference to search in the box with the smaller hole. And in the unconstrained condition, they overwhelmingly search in the box with the larger opening. And because this was within subjects, we can also look at children's paired responses across both conditions. And in green, you'll see that 66% of the children searched in the right box across conditions. So in the small hole box in the constrained condition and the big hole box in the unconstrained condition. So these results suggest that children were using the physical constraints of the experimenter to think about what action she likely performed or didn't perform, and use that information to figure out where the toy was likely located. But you might be thinking, wait, Sophie, not so fast. There's another explanation for what could be going on in the unconstrained and constrained conditions. So in the unconstrained conditions, children have all of the information that they need. It's actually potentially a quite straightforward situation. They only need to remember where that frog is located. So remember that the frog was in the big hole box. And this could mean that in an ambiguous situation like the constrained condition, they might still be falling back on a heuristic to help them, like I go to the small hole, you go to the big hole. So what we would really like is to create a situation where the physical constraints don't also correlate with size information between the adult and the child. So this is what we look at in experiment 2. So the first condition is going to look quite similar. We changed the boxes slightly. So again, they both have, one has a small hole, one has a big hole, but the heights of these holes differ. So the big hole is up towards the top of the box, and the small hole is down towards the bottom of the box. In the small constraint condition, the experimenter puts on these gardening gloves. She says, look, these gardening gloves make my hands so big. Isn't that silly? And then she demonstrates that she can reach inside the big hole box, but that her hand is just too big to reach inside the small hole box. So again, this is the same constraint as what we saw in experiment 1. So then, Teresa and I were trying to figure out how in the world we could make the big hole box challenging for the adult. And this is what we came up with. I'm going to put on these slings in this game. I have to keep my arms in these slings. Isn't this so silly? My arms are so short. The 3-year-olds did not find this silly at all, just stared at us and went, okay, let's keep going. Very literal, totally fine. And so now, because the experimenter's arms are so short, she can reach inside to reach the bottom of the box with the small hole, but she can't actually reach down to the bottom of the box with the big hole. So presumably, if there was a toy at the bottom of that box, she would not be able to get it. So here, identical cows are placed, 1 and 2 each box, and we made a slight change where the experimenter actually takes both boxes underneath the table and says, I'm gonna try to get both of these cows, but she comes up short. She says, I got 1 cow, but I was not able to get the other cow. Can you help me get the other cow? So what do we see? In the small constraint condition, we see that children again are searching in the box with the smaller hole, and they're doing so significantly more often in the big constraint condition. So this provides additional support for the idea that in experiment 1, children were not just reasoning about kind of the size differences in terms of a bias to just go towards the small hole, but actually reasoning about the physical constraints that they learned about in the context of the experiment. So understanding how your physical abilities compare to others, what actions are available to you in an environment, what actions are available to another person, is fundamental to coordinating your actions with this other person. We find in these experiments that 3-year-olds can flexibly reason about specific physical constraints of another person to infer what that person did and respond cooperatively, even though these physical constraints differed from their own. Here they were making a retrospective inference about the goal another person failed to achieve, but we have evidence from older children that they can make a similar inference prospectively. So if 5, 6, and 7-year-olds are shown 2 toys, one of which is really easy to figure out and another of which is really challenging to figure out, they can anticipate that somebody's going to struggle with the challenging toy, and so they should teach them how that toy works. So a question arises here of whether or not 3-year-olds might be able to kind of perform this same box task prospectively. So before the experimenter even struggles with the small hole or the big hole, might they be able to use the constraint information to anticipate that struggle and preemptively get the toy out of the box that they're going to struggle with. We also saw some evidence in the second experiment that the slings condition might be a little bit harder for children than the gloves condition. Arguably, this is a slightly weirder condition, but also it's possible that kind of reaching down into the bottom of a box is kind of physically more challenging to understand than reaching inside a box. But it's also interesting to note that here the constraints really differ from children's broader experience. So they interact potentially with younger children who have shorter arms than they do, but they rarely interact with adults who have shorter arms. And actually, some children even remarked that their arms actually are shorter than the experimenters, suggesting that this actually might be a difference that they're paying attention to in their environment. And I think this could have implications and raise interesting questions for how children interact with people who have really different physical abilities and constraints than they're familiar with. So how might they interact or think about people who have physical disabilities? I'm in a symposium looking at children's reasoning about alternatives. It's not necessarily kind of the crux of this study, but I think it is fundamental to children's success in these tasks. In a sense, they could be doing an inferential reasoning by exclusion, so somewhat similar in structure to the cups task. In the cups task, though, often children get evidence directly that one cup is empty and one cup is still baited, whereas here, children don't directly see which toy, that one box is empty and one box still has a toy, but rather have to use physical constraint information to think about which box likely is empty and which box likely has a toy. So it could be interesting to explore further to see whether or not they're actually reasoning by exclusion here, or if they're solving this task in a simpler way, potentially just focusing on the box that the experimenter is struggling with and kind of thinking about just that one box the whole time. Think also if indeed children are coordinating their physical abilities with the experimenter's physical abilities and constraints, they're doing so at an age where they're struggling to coordinate multiple perspectives or mental states, which raises questions also about why reasoning about physical abilities might be easier than reasoning about mental states, or why coordination might be different in these different domains. So taking a step back, children are not just observers of their social world, they're active participants. And so by studying children's ability to deploy and use their social reasoning in action, we can see how earlier sensitivities and expectations may or may not manifest in actual social behavior. which raises questions about the robustness and flexibility of these early representations, but also what additional skills are needed to translate our knowledge into action. And I think kind of understanding how knowledge gets translated into action is really important, because as adults, we often recognize that actions can speak louder than thoughts. So thank you very much for listening, and the organizers and everyone.
Thank you, Sophie. We have some time for questions. Maybe someone from the back. If not, then I saw Hannah.
Thank you for the talk. Okay. So I was just wondering that you were talking about coordination. And so to what extent this example that you showed is really about coordination? Because what you are doing, that you ask the child explicitly to help, which sort of implies that, yeah, there is something that I couldn't do, but you could do. So do you think that if, I don't know, there was a situation where, I don't know, there would be a need for spontaneous coordination, then there would be this kind of recognition that, yes, I have, I don't know, like different skills to solve this task compared to the other?
Yes, I definitely think so. So I think that this is providing some evidence that children might be able to do this type of coordination by reasoning about others' constraints and their own abilities. But I think a much stronger task would be able to see something like, okay, we're about to solve the task, we need to get these toys out as fast as possible, let's go, and see if children kind of recognize which box they should go to and the other person should go to, or if you ask them ahead of time, kind of to assign roles or things like that. So that's definitely the direction that we're planning on going in. So thank you for the question.
More questions? Yes?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I wonder, I would like to hear your thoughts on how you think the difficulty is represented. Are children thinking in terms of low probability of success for a given agent, perhaps even impossibility? Are they considering levels of effort, kind of cost to the agent to achieve something? Are they like engaging in this mechanistic inquiry, trying to understand the mechanisms and what would need to be modified in this system or be different in order to achieve it? I mean, there's a ton of other options. I'm just curious about how you think about this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's possible that they could be reasoning about all of those things. I think this data doesn't speak to that, though. I think at the simplest level, they're probably reasoning about like what this person just can't do, so impossibility. But I think there is evidence to suggest that children this age might be sensitive to more graded notions of cost. And it would be quite interesting to kind of compare an option that's harder and an option that's easier and see if they would be able to make the same types of inferences. We started with this kind of more heavy-handed manipulation just to see if they could do it. But moving forward, I think it would be interesting to kind of probe how they're reasoning about difficulty more broadly. And I think that's also kind of a goal of the lab as a whole, too. So it'd be fun to kind of explore that in tandem with some of the other problems that we're working on. So.
Okay, thank you very much for our speaker. Sophie?